All right, let's jump right in. Today we're taking a deep dive into the book of 2 Samuel.
Buckle up, because this one is a wild ride.
We're talking ancient kings, epic battles, political intrigue.
Family drama.
Oh, yeah, tons of that.
And it all revolves around one of the most fascinating figures in the Bible, King David.
So, for anyone who's maybe only heard the David and Goliath version of the story,
There's so much more to discover.
this book is a deep dive into David's reign. We see his incredible victories,
His heartbreaking failures.
his struggles with faith and leadership.
It's all laid bare, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
But before we get into all that, let's set the scene. The book opens with David receiving news about King Saul and Jonathan.
And it's not good news.
Not at all. They've both been killed in battle.
And David's reaction is powerful. He doesn't hold back his grief.
It's a full-on ancient mourning ritual. Tearing clothes, throwing dirt on his head.
This tells us right away that David is a man of deep emotion.
He's not afraid to show his vulnerability, even for Saul, who was his rival, even his enemy at times.
Right, and this lament that David sings, it's beautiful, it's poetic.
And it reveals a lot about his character.
Loyalty, respect, a deep sense of loss.
Which makes what happens next even more interesting. Because with Saul gone, there's a power vacuum.
Enter Ishbosheth, Saul's son.
Who you would think would be the natural successor.
You'd think, but David's got other plans.
And the skills to back him up. Because this is where we start to see David's strategic genius come into play.
He doesn't just jump in and try to seize power.
No, he's patient, he's calculating.
He starts building alliances, uniting different tribes under his leadership.
And he does it with a mix of military might and, I gotta say, a ton of charisma.
David was clearly a captivating leader.
He had that it factor.
Think about it. Israel at this point is like a shattered vase, broken pieces scattered everywhere.
And David is the one who starts putting those pieces back together.
Mm-hmm.
He brings stability to a nation that desperately needs it.
And one of his boldest moves is the capture of Jerusalem.
Ah, yes. This is classic David.
This city was considered impenetrable, a Jebusite stronghold.
But David finds a way.
Uses the city's water system like a secret passage.
Talk about thinking outside the box. It's a brilliant military maneuver.
It establishes Jerusalem as David's capital.
A capital that will shape the future of Israel for centuries to come.
Politically and religiously, it all starts here.
Okay, so we've got David, the warrior king, unifying the nation, establishing his capital.
Things are looking pretty good.
But then things take a turn. A very strange turn.
Enter the Ark of the Covenant.
Right. This isn't just any old treasure chest.
This is the Ark, the symbol of God's presence among the people.
And David decides he wants to bring it to Jerusalem. Big celebration, huge procession. The text even says he's dancing with all his might.
You can almost hear the music, feel the energy. This is a joyous occasion.
But then Uzzah happens.
Ah, yes. Uzzah. This is where things get a little complicated.
1 minute everyone's partying, the next someone's dead for touching the ark.
And it seems so random, but it actually reveals a fundamental concept in the Old Testament.
The holiness of God. The idea that God's presence is powerful, even dangerous.
The ark wasn't just some artifact. It represented something sacred, something that demanded reverence and respect.
And Uzzah, even though he may have had good intentions, he didn't follow the proper protocol. And there were consequences.
It's a stark reminder that approaching the divine requires caution and a deep understanding of the rules.
And look, I don't know about you, but this story definitely makes me think twice about casually touching ancient artifacts.
Me too. But for David, this wasn't just about museum etiquette. This was a turning point in his faith.
He goes from leading the conga line to literally shaking in his sandals.
He's terrible.
Realizing the immense power of the God he serves.
It's a moment of growth.
Of realizing that faith isn't just about celebration and joy.
It's also about awe, reverence, and recognizing the weight of responsibility.
So far, we've seen David conquer enemies, unify the nation, establish his capital, bring the ark to Jerusalem. It's like he's on a winning streak.
But we all know how the saying goes, right? The bigger they are,
the harder they fall.
And boy, does David fall.
Because now we're heading into the episode that probably needs no introduction, David and Bathsheba.
This is where things get really messy.
And complicated.
We see David, at the height of his power, make a series of choices that will have consequences for the rest of his life.
It's a stark reminder that even the heroes of the Bible are human.
Are flawed.
They make mistakes.
Big ones.
It starts with adultery.
David sees Bathsheba bathing.
And he's captivated.
He sends for her.
They sleep together.
And she gets pregnant.
Now, David could have owned up to his actions, but instead,
He tries to cover it up,
he calls Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, back from the battlefield.
hoping he'll sleep with his wife, make it look like the baby is his.
But Uriah, this guy's a stand-up soldier. He refuses to go home while his comrades are still fighting.
So David gets desperate,
He sends Uriah back to the front lines.
with instructions to put him in the most dangerous position.
Basically a death sentence.
And it works.
Uriah is killed.
David has committed adultery, and now he's responsible for a man's death.
It's a brutal turn of events.
It raises all sorts of questions about power, about sin, about the consequences of our actions.
It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You see it coming, you know it's going to be bad, but you can't look away.
But what makes this story so compelling is that it doesn't end there, because there's another element at play here. Repentance.
Enter Nathan the prophet.
This guy is amazing.
He confronts David.
Not directly, though. He uses a parable.
A story about a rich man who steals a poor man's lamb.
David, of course, is outraged. He demands justice for the poor man.
He totally misses the point.
Until Nathan drops the bomb. You are the man.
It's a mic drop moment.
David is exposed.
He can't deny it anymore.
And his response is incredible.
There's no justification.
No blame shifting.
He owns his sin completely.
He says, I have sinned against the Lord.
That confession is so raw, so powerful.
It's a reminder that even when we mess up royally,
And I mean royally,
there's still hope.
true repentance is possible.
But, and this is a big but, forgiveness doesn't erase the consequences.
No, those consequences are still very real.
And we see that play out in the rest of David's story.
He loses his child.
His family is fractured.
His kingdom is thrown into chaos.
And that's just the beginning.
We'll have to pick up the rest of this story in part 2 of our deep dive.
But before we go, I want to leave you with this thought.
This whole David and Bathsheba episode, it's not just some ancient scandal.
It's a reflection of a universal human experience.
We all make mistakes.
Some big, some small.
But how we respond to those mistakes.
That's what matters.
David's story shows us that owning our failures, seeking forgiveness,
That's the path to redemption.
even when the consequences are hard.
Even when the road ahead is long and uncertain.
Okay, so we left off with David facing the consequences of his sin, a dead child, a family falling apart, and a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos.
It's like a domino effect, you know? One bad choice leads to another, and pretty soon the whole structure is at risk of collapsing.
And in David's case, the cracks start to show within his own family.
This is where things get really messy, almost Shakespearean in terms of the drama and betrayal.
Yeah, buckle up, because we're about to enter the world of Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom.
This is a story that's tough to read. It deals with sexual assault and the ripple effects of trauma within a family.
It starts with Amnon, David's oldest son. He develops this unhealthy obsession with his half-sister Tamar.
And it's not just a simple crush, it's a twisted infatuation that leads him down a very dark path.
He gets some truly terrible advice from a friend, comes up with this elaborate plan to trick Tamar, and ends up raping her.
It's a horrific act of violence, and it completely shatters the family dynamic.
Absalom, Tamar's full brother, he's understandably enraged.
He wants justice for his sister, but David, as a father and as a king, he fails to act decisively.
He doesn't punish Amnon, he doesn't provide justice for Tamar, and this inaction has devastating consequences.
It allows this toxic resentment to fester, creating a breeding ground for Absalom's revenge.
And Absalom is not one to let things go. He waits, he plots, he bides his time for years.
Talk about holding a grudge. This is like next-level revenge planning.
And eventually he gets his chance. He throws this big party, invites all of David's sons, and in the middle of the festivities, he has Amnon murdered.
So now we have two of David's sons dead, one by the hand of the other, and the kingdom is teetering on the edge of collapse.
It's a direct result of David's failure to act, his inability to confront the darkness within his own family.
And it creates the perfect opportunity for Absalom to seize power.
Oh yeah, Absalom's not done yet.
This guy is ambitious, he's cunning, and he sees a chance to take what he believes is rightfully his, the throne.
After a period of exile, he returns to Israel and starts building his own following.
He charms the people, he plays on their dissatisfaction with David's leadership, and pretty soon he's got a full-blown rebellion on his hands.
Imagine that. Your own son turning against you, challenging everything you've built, trying to take everything you have.
It's a nightmare scenario for any parent, but for David, it's also a political crisis of epic proportions.
The text describes him fleeing Jerusalem, literally running for his life, as Absalom's forces take over the city.
There's this incredibly vivid scene where a guy named Shimei starts cursing David, throwing stones at him, covering him with dirt.
Talk about hitting rock bottom. This is David at his lowest point.
Stripped of his power, betrayed by his son, publicly humiliated and rejected by his own people.
But even in this moment of utter despair, we see a glimpse of the man David is becoming.
He shows restraint. He chooses not to retaliate against Shimei.
He understands that sometimes true leadership means accepting humiliation, bearing the weight of your mistakes.
And as dark as things seem, there's a glimmer of hope on the horizon.
Enter Hushai, David's loyal advisor.
This guy's a smooth operator, a master strategist.
He comes up with this daring plan to infiltrate Absalom's inner circle.
He's like a double agent, pretending to be on Absalom's side while secretly working to undermine him.
It's a risky move, but it's also a brilliant one.
Hushai starts feeding Absalom bad advice, delaying his plans, giving David time to regroup and strategize.
And it works. Absalom, blinded by ambition and surrounded by yes men, falls right into the trap. This leads to the final showdown, a battle between David's forces and Absalom's rebels.
It's a brutal, bloody affair.
And in the end, David emerges victorious.
But it's a victory tinged with tragedy.
Because Absalom is killed during the battle.
And despite everything that's happened, despite the betrayal and the pain, David is heartbroken.
He cries out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you."
It's one of the most powerful expressions of grief and love in the entire Bible.
It shows us that even in the midst of conflict, even when dealing with the consequences of sin and rebellion, there's still room for compassion.
There's still room for a father's love.
So David returns to Jerusalem. He's victorious, but deeply scarred.
He's got a lot of work to do, healing a kingdom divided and rebuilding trust.
And that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Stay tuned as we unpack the last chapters of 2 Samuel and discover how David navigates the challenges of restoration, justice, and preparing for a future beyond his own reign. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into 2 Samuel. Last time we left off with David, victorious but heartbroken after the rebellion, facing the daunting task of putting his kingdom back together.
It's like trying to fix a shattered vase, you know? You can glue the pieces back together, but the cracks are still there.
And in David's case, those cracks run deep. He's dealing with the aftermath of war, betrayal, and the lingering consequences of his own sin.
It would be easy to just focus on rebuilding, on strengthening his grip on power, but David does something really interesting in these final chapters.
He turns inward. He starts wrestling with some pretty big themes: forgiveness, justice, and even preparing for a future beyond his own reign.
It's almost like he's taking stock of his life, trying to figure out what really matters.
And one of the first things we see is this incredible act of mercy. Remember Shimei?
The guy who cursed David threw rocks at him when he was fleeing Jerusalem.
That's the one. Most kings would have had him executed without a second thought.
Right. But David, he actually pardons him.
It's a powerful statement about forgiveness, about choosing to break the cycle of violence and revenge.
It shows that even in the midst of all this chaos, David is still striving to be a righteous leader, a leader who reflects God's mercy.
But forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring the past. It doesn't mean sweeping things under the rug.
No, and we see that play out in the complex situation with the Gibeonites.
Now, this goes way back, even before David's time, back to when Joshua was leading the Israelites.
Right, the Gibeonites had tricked Joshua into making a treaty with them.
And later, Saul, in a misguided attempt to protect Israel, breaks that treaty and massacres many of them.
It's a terrible act of injustice.
And now, during David's reign, a famine strikes the land, and God reveals that it's a direct consequence of Saul's actions.
So David is left to deal with this legacy of violence, this broken promise from a previous generation.
What do you do when you inherit the consequences of someone else's sin?
It's a tough question, right? But David doesn't shy away from it. He could have easily blamed Saul or tried to justify his actions.
Instead, he recognizes the wrong that was done. He seeks a resolution. He talks to the Gibeonites and asks them what needs to be done to atone for this past sin.
And their demand is pretty intense. They want 7 of Saul's descendants to be executed.
It's a stark reminder of how seriously covenants were taken in the ancient world.
Breaking an oath wasn't just a personal matter. It had far-reaching consequences, sometimes extending across generations.
It's a difficult passage to read, but it highlights a key theme that runs throughout the Bible.
Actions have consequences.
Sometimes those consequences extend far beyond our own lives. And while forgiveness is always possible, it doesn't necessarily erase those consequences.
But even in this situation, we see David balancing justice with mercy.
Right. He specifically spares Mephibosheth.
Jonathan's son, because of the covenant he made with Jonathan.
He honors that promise even in the midst of this incredibly difficult situation.
It shows that justice isn't always about strict retribution. It's about finding a balance between accountability and compassion, between upholding the law and honoring past commitments.
So we've got David dealing with the past, seeking forgiveness, administering justice, but he's also looking towards the future.
Yes, specifically towards the building of the temple.
Now, David himself isn't allowed to build it, but he puts everything in motion.
He gathers materials, he draws up plans, he even buys the land for the temple site from a man named Araunah the Jebusite.
And this little interaction with Araunah is really revealing. Araunah offers to give him the land for free.
Right. He's like, take it, King David, it's yours, a gift.
But David refuses. He insists on paying full price. He says, I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt sacrifices that cost me nothing.
Wow. Powerful words.
It shows us something about David's heart.
It's not enough to just go through the motions. True worship, true service to God, it requires sacrifice. It requires putting your money where your mouth is.
It also shows David's humility. He's the king. He could easily take what he wants, but he recognizes that everything he has ultimately belongs to God.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 2 Samuel, what stands out to you about David's story? What's the big takeaway?
For me, it's the reminder that even the greatest among us are human. David is this complex character. He's a warrior, a poet, a king, a sinner, a father.
Right. He experiences incredible highs and devastating lows. He makes amazing choices and some really terrible ones.
And through it all, he's wrestling with his faith, trying to figure out how to live a life that honors God, even when he messes up.
It's not a neat and tidy story. It's messy, it's raw, and it resonates because it's so relatable.
I mean, who hasn't made a bad decision? Who hasn't struggled with temptation, with guilt, with the consequences of their actions?
Exactly. David's story reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles.
But ultimately, 2 Samuel is a story of hope. It shows us that even when we fall short, even when we make a mess of things, forgiveness is possible.
And not just forgiveness from God, but also forgiveness of ourselves and of others.
David's journey teaches us about the power of repentance, about the importance of seeking justice and showing mercy.
It reminds us that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about learning from our mistakes and striving to become better, even when the road ahead is uncertain.
So as we close this chapter of our exploration, I want to encourage you to keep reflecting on David's story.
What lessons can you apply to your own life? How can his triumphs and failures inspire you to lead with more integrity, to be more forgiving, to embrace the complexities of faith and the human experience?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into 2 Samuel. We'll see you next time for another fascinating journey into the world of ancient texts and their enduring relevance for our lives today.